Have you ever been underestimated by everyone around you, treated like you had no worth? What if I told you that behind the greatest hardships, there might be a key to a transformation you never imagined? Today, you're going to hear the story of Isabella, a young woman who, working as a waitress in a restaurant, faced humiliation and disdain, unaware that her destiny was about to change in a surprising way. Now, get ready to dive into this story of overcoming, where the unexpected is waiting at every turn. Chapter 1. The beginning of the journey. Isabella, a young woman with a kind heart full of empathy, always believed that kindness and respect were the foundation of any relationship. She grew up in a small town with simple values and never suspected that there was a big secret about her true origin. Eager to understand how people worked at the lower levels of a company, Isabella decided to apply for a job as a waitress at one of the most prestigious restaurants in town. For her, this was going to be an enriching experience, but what was coming would be far more intense than she could have ever imagined. On her first day of work, arriving at the restaurant, Isabella felt like a stranger in a new world. The place was grand, with perfectly arranged tables, sparkling chandeliers, and a refined atmosphere that made her feel small. She put on her uniform with a mix of anxiety and nervousness. She knew she was about to face a reality she wasn't familiar with, but she was determined to do her best. However, from the start, she noticed that her co-workers' glances weren't friendly. There was a cold atmosphere around her. The supervisor, Carl, a man with a stern face and unforgiving eyes, wasted no time showing his displeasure with her. He had a reputation for being strict and ruthless, and Isabella was quickly going to be his next target. "You're new here, so don't expect it to be easy," were his first words, spoken with a sarcastic tone that made Isabella's stomach turn. His authoritarian demeanor left no room for kindness. In that moment, she realized it wouldn't be easy. Carl didn't take long to criticize her for every little detail, from the way she held the tray to how she spoke to customers. "Do you think this is some corner diner? Here, perfection is the bare minimum," he would say with a cynical smile, leaving her flustered in front of the others. Her mistakes, no matter how minor, were blown up by Carl in front of everyone, making her feel humiliated with every passing second. As she tried to adjust to the fast-paced environment of the restaurant, her co-workers offered no sympathy. Mariana, one of the more experienced waitresses, seemed to take pleasure in seeing Isabella mess up. "She won't last long here," Mariana would whisper to the others whenever Isabella wasn't around. There was a sense of exclusion that made Isabella feel more and more isolated. She had come in with such good intentions, but now she was struggling to keep her head. The first few days were tough. Isabella silently endured the constant humiliation and criticism, trying to hide how much it hurt. At night, alone in her small apartment, she replayed the moments of shame and wondered if she had made a mistake by taking the job. Deep down, something kept her going. Maybe it was the desire to learn, to grow from the difficulties, or perhaps a deeper instinct she didn't yet understand. At the end of one of those exhausting days, Isabella retreated to the small employee locker room. Sitting on a bench with trembling hands and aching feet, she tried to hold back her tears. "I can handle this," she whispered to herself, trying to find strength. But deep down, she felt small and vulnerable. Carl's words and the co-workers' snickers echoed in her mind, hurting her heart. Isabella knew she had to be strong. Her natural sweetness kept her from reacting with aggression, and her desire to avoid conflict made her swallow each criticism. She continued day after day without understanding why this was happening to her, but one thing was growing in her heart. There was a bigger purpose. Maybe, deep down, she felt that all of this was a test, a trial she had to face to reach something far greater than she could see at the moment. Chapter 2. The Weight of Humiliations. The days at the restaurant became a heavy routine for Isabella. Every morning she woke up with a mix of anxiety and exhaustion. Even after just a few weeks, the physical and emotional toll was already weighing on her deeply. Carl, the supervisor, continued his relentless criticism. It seemed like he took pleasure in finding any reason to scold her, as if he was determined to prove that she wasn't good enough to work there. "You're not going to last long," he would say dryly, looking at her with disdain. Each day the humiliations intensified. Isabella was often interrupted while serving tables, with Carl correcting her in front of customers. "This isn't a fast food joint," he exclaimed on a busy night, drawing laughter from some customers and pity from others. Isabella's face burned with shame, but she kept her head down, trying to hide how much it hurt. The humiliation didn't come only from Carl. Her co-workers, noticing that she was the supervisor's favorite target, began treating her with the same indifference and contempt. Mariana, the senior waitress, led the group that would quietly laugh at Isabella whenever something went wrong. "She won't make it to the end of the month," Mariana whispered to the other staff, as if she was already sure of Isabella's failure. However, what hurt Isabella the most was the lack of support. She had imagined that despite the challenges, she would find some supportive co-workers, but each person was only concerned with their own survival in the restaurant's toxic environment. The job, which was supposed to be a learning experience, was turning into an increasingly heavy burden. One night, after an especially difficult day, Isabella spilled a glass of wine on an important customer. Before she could apologize, Carl appeared by her side, grabbing her arm firmly. "Incompetent," he muttered, loud enough for the customer to hear. "You should have never been hired." Those words cut deep into her heart, and for the first time, she wondered if she really should stay. Isabella quickly retreated to the locker room, tears welling up in her eyes. In the small, cracked mirror, she looked at her reflection. "Why am I here?" she whispered to herself as the tears rolled down. Her parents had always taught her to be strong and persistent, but now, with each passing day, she felt like she was losing a part of herself. Yet something inside her, a small glimmer of hope, kept telling her she needed to push forward. Maybe it was her faith, the sense that every challenge carried a lesson with it. Even when everything seemed impossible, Isabella clung to the belief that in the end, her perseverance would be rewarded. Taking a deep breath, she wiped her tears and prepared to head back to the floor. After all, her shift wasn't over yet. Chapter 3. The Climb of Injustice. As the weeks went by, the situation at the restaurant only seemed to get worse. Each day was a new opportunity for Carl to find faults in Isabella's work. He didn't just criticize her, he made a point to humiliate her in front of the most influential clients. "It seems like you were born to fail," he commented on a busy day, when Isabella, already exhausted, dropped a plate at a table of important guests. The silence that followed was cutting, and the eyes of everyone in the room turned to her, each stare weighing on her shoulders. Though the customers were surprised by Carl's harshness, none of them spoke up to defend her. The elitist atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to fuel a coldness where mistakes were unforgivable. No matter how hard Isabella tried, she couldn't find a moment of peace. Every gesture, every word she spoke was monitored, and Carl always found something to criticize. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, her co-workers followed Carl's lead. Mariana, who used to limit her comments to whispers, now felt free to openly make jokes at Isabella's expense. "Careful not to trip again, Isabella," she said mockingly as she hurried down the hallway. Other staff laughed, not caring about the impact it had. Isabella began to wonder if she could survive in this environment much longer. One day, Isabella was tasked with serving a large table reserved for a corporate event. Nervous but determined to do everything right, she prepared every detail with the utmost care. However, in the middle of the service, Carl appeared to supervise, as usual. "You're placing the glasses wrong," he said, snatching them from her hands and slamming them onto the table, causing one of the clients to raise an eyebrow. Isabella wanted to scream but stayed calm. She knew that any reaction could make things worse. The night continued with tension. Despite all of Isabella's efforts, Carl still found reasons to scold her, and at a critical moment, he pulled her aside, away from the client's view. "You'll never be good enough to work here. You should consider another profession," he whispered with a cruel smile. It was a hard blow. For a moment, Isabella wondered if he was right. The emotional pain was starting to weigh just as much as the physical exhaustion. Isabella felt her strength slipping away, but something inside her wouldn't let her give up. Maybe it was her sense of justice, her faith that good things come to those who persevere. She clung to that belief, even though the reality around her seemed to say otherwise. Each day the burden grew heavier, but Isabella kept standing. That night, alone in her apartment, Isabella stared at the ceiling, reflecting on everything that had happened. Is it worth it? Doubt was creeping in, but she knew it wasn't time to give up yet. Something deep down told her that there was a bigger reason for all of this. Chapter 4. A ray of hope. Despite all the suffering Isabella endured at the restaurant, there was something that kept her strong and determined to carry on. Her mother, who had always been her rock, had been ill for months. A diagnosis of a chronic illness had devastated the family, and the treatment was expensive. Isabella knew she needed the money from this job to cover the medical bills, and no matter how toxic the work environment was, she couldn't afford to quit. Her mother's life depended on her resilience. Every time Carl humiliated her or Mariana made her cruel remarks, Isabella thought of her mother's fragile smile. It was that image that made her get up every day, put on the uniform, and face another shift full of humiliation. The pressure on her shoulders was immense, but her love for her mother and the need to take care of her pushed her forward. Just one more day, she would tell herself each morning, as her feet felt heavy walking to the restaurant. During one of those difficult shifts, a small glimmer of hope appeared. An elderly woman entered the restaurant, different from any other customer Isabella had served. With a warm smile, the woman treated her with a kindness that Isabella no longer expected to find in that place. "You seem like a very strong young woman," said the lady as Isabella served her dinner. Those words, simple but sincere, struck Isabella at a time of deep emotional exhaustion. The woman didn't just offer compliments. She gave Isabella words of encouragement that touched her heart. "Don't let the hardships dim the light you carry. Keep going, for great things are ahead." Those words brought a comfort that Isabella didn't even realize she needed. In the midst of so much disdain and humiliation, someone had finally seen her true essence. In the days that followed, Isabella held on to that brief memory of the elderly woman. Whenever Carl ridiculed her or Mariana made spiteful remarks, she repeated to herself, "I am strong. I can get through this." But even with this new spark of hope, reality remained relentless. The work was exhausting, the atmosphere oppressive, and the weight of her mother's illness hung over her. The need to keep going was as strong as the pain she felt with each new humiliation. One particularly busy night, as Isabella rushed between tables, a small mistake happened. An important customer complained that the order was wrong, and Carl, as usual, seized the opportunity to humiliate her in front of everyone. "You're an embarrassment to this restaurant. How can you be so incompetent?" His words cut deep once again, but no matter how much they hurt, Isabella knew she couldn't give up. Her mother needed her, and that was more important than any humiliation Carl could inflict. Isabella still held on to the hope that one day things would change. Maybe it was her faith that kept her standing, or maybe it was simply her love for her mother, but somehow she managed to keep going. The internal struggle between the desire to quit and the need to keep going was constant, but deep down Isabella knew it wasn't time to walk away from this fight. Chapter 5. The Inner Storm. The days followed the same rhythm, and despite her strength, Isabella was starting to feel the effects of so much suffering. The burden of her life at the restaurant was becoming unbearable. She knew she needed the job, but the emotional weight of each shift seemed to grow exponentially. Her mother, even in her frail state, always encouraged her to keep going. "You're stronger than you think, my daughter," she would say with a weak yet loving voice. Those words echoed in Isabella's mind every time she thought about giving up. However, the pressure at the restaurant only increased. Carl, now more cruel than ever, found any excuse to criticize her in front of her co-workers. One day he called her into the office, accusing her of breaking a crystal glass during service, something that wasn't her fault. "You don't have any more chances here. You should have been fired by now," he declared with a venomous tone. Isabella knew arguing with him wouldn't help. All she could do was swallow her words and return to the floor with her head down. Mariana, noticing Isabella's despair, seized every moment to taunt her. "Looks like your time here is almost up, huh?" she would say with a malicious smile. It was clear that Mariana took pleasure in seeing Isabella's suffering, which only made the environment more unbearable. Every day at the restaurant felt like a battlefield, and Isabella was tired of fighting. But amid all the chaos, there was something that kept Isabella going. Her faith, something her mother had taught her since she was a child, was her source of strength. In her silent prayers, she asked for the strength to carry on, to endure one more day, one more humiliation, one more exhausting shift. Something inside her told her that, despite everything, she was there for a greater purpose. One night, after returning home from another difficult day, Isabella found her mother in much worse condition than usual. Her health seemed to be deteriorating quickly, and Isabella felt panic rising. "I can't lose her," she thought, as she held her mother's frail hand. This fear shook her deeply, but it also gave her a fierce determination to keep going. "I will do whatever it takes to keep her alive," she promised herself, even if it meant enduring more humiliations. Isabella's inner struggle was constant. On one hand, she longed to leave that toxic job and escape the daily humiliations. On the other hand, she knew her mother depended on her, and there wasn't another viable option at the moment. The medical bills couldn't wait, and each day of work was a battle Isabella had to win, even if it was a bitter and painful victory. Chapter 6. The Final Blow. The days were already hard enough for Isabella. The weight of her mother's illness, the pressure at work, and the daily humiliations made her life a constant struggle. However, she didn't know that the worst was still to come. After returning home from another exhausting shift at the restaurant, Isabella found a letter from the bank in the mailbox. It was an envelope she had feared receiving for months, but had tried to ignore in the midst of so much suffering. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and read the first few lines. Her heart raced. It was an eviction notice. The bank informed her that, due to several missed mortgage payments, the house where she and her mother lived would be seized in a few weeks. All the family's money had gone toward her mother's treatment, leaving the bills unpaid, and now, what she feared most was about to happen. Isabella sat at the table, unable to hold back her tears. That house was all that remained of their sense of security, the only place where her mother could rest amidst the battle with her illness. Now they were about to lose even that. What else can go wrong, she thought, feeling the weight of despair grow heavier. It was as if the world were collapsing on her. At that moment, the situation became unbearable. Isabella was already emotionally drained from her job at the restaurant, from the constant humiliations by Carl and Mariana, and now she had to face the looming loss of her home. Tears streamed freely down her face as she stared at the letter, not knowing what to do. How am I going to tell my mother? She can't go through this too, she thought, as fear and guilt consumed her. In the days that followed, Isabella tried to continue with her routine at the restaurant, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. Carl, as always, criticized her for every little detail. "You're more distracted than usual. You know this isn't a joke, right?" he said, a cruel smile on his lips. Little did he know the turmoil Isabella was going through. Mariana, noticing Isabella was even more vulnerable, didn't miss the chance to increase her suffering. "I don't think you'll last even another week. Must be terrible not having anywhere to go, huh?" she teased, making it clear that she knew about Isabella's financial troubles. No matter how hard Isabella tried, she couldn't find the strength to fight back. Her mind was consumed with fear of losing the house, her mother's illness, and the humiliation at work. With each shift, Isabella felt more suffocated, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Yet, deep down, something still made her keep going. Maybe it was the unconditional love for her mother, or maybe it was her faith, which, although shaken, still existed. But the solutions seemed further and further away, and Isabella wondered how much longer she could endure before completely falling apart. Chapter 7. On the edge of the abyss, the days following the arrival of the bank's letter were the hardest of Isabella's life. Each shift at the restaurant felt longer and more unbearable, and the weight of the eviction notice, combined with her mother's fragile health, left her emotionally exhausted. She didn't know how to deal with everything at once. Each morning she woke up feeling fear take over her body, but she knew she had no choice but to keep going. Her mother's treatment depended on the money from this job, no matter how cruel and humiliating it was. However, Isabella began to realize that she couldn't hide the truth from her mother for much longer. Each day, the letter from the bank sat on the table, a constant reminder of the impending disaster. She knew she had to tell her mother, but the thought of seeing the look of despair on her mother's face paralyzed her. "How can I destroy the little hope she has left?" Isabella thought as she stared at the letter, unable to bring herself to open it again. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Carl seemed to sense that something was wrong with Isabella. But instead of showing any form of understanding, he ramped up the humiliations. "If your mind's somewhere else, why don't you go there and leave us in peace?" he sneered during one of his cruel comments, drawing laughter from some of the staff. Mariana, as usual, fueled the fire, throwing in her own small jabs whenever she got the chance. Despite everything, Isabella tried to stay strong. She knew she couldn't afford to break down, but each day was harder than the last. Her financial situation was unsustainable, and she knew time was running out. Her mother, though visibly weaker, still greeted her with a tired smile each night. That was what kept her going, but it was also what tore her apart inside. The guilt of not being able to provide more for her mother, of not being able to protect her from what was coming, was overwhelming. One night, as Isabella was getting ready for bed, she heard her mother coughing violently in the next room. The sound made her rush in, only to find her mother even more frail than the night before. Her face was pale and her breathing was labored. Isabella held her hand, feeling despair rise in her chest. "I promise we'll get through this, Mom. I promise," she whispered, trying to convince both herself and her mother that there was a way out. But deep down, doubt lingered. The next morning, when Isabella arrived at the restaurant, she could barely focus. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed with worry about her mother and the eviction notice. During her shift, as she tried to serve a table, she accidentally dropped an entire tray of glasses. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the dining room, and all eyes turned toward her. Carl, as always, seized the opportunity. This is what happens when you bring personal problems to work. If you can't separate things, maybe it's time to leave for good. Carl's words hit her hard, but instead of reacting, Isabella just looked at him with empty eyes. She was exhausted, emotionally drained. In that moment, she realized she was on the verge of breaking down. It was as if her entire world was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Chapter 8. The Light That Fades. After yet another exhausting shift at the restaurant, Isabella returned home with a heavy heart. Each day seemed harder to endure, and the worry about her mother and the eviction notice left her in a constant state of anguish. As she approached her front door that evening, she noticed something strange. The lights were off. At first, she thought her mother might be sleeping, but when she entered, she realized the problem was much more serious. The house was plunged into complete darkness. There were no lights, no electricity. She tried turning on the lamps, but nothing worked. That's when reality hit her hard. The power had been cut off. With the debts piling up and all the money going toward her mother's treatment, the bills had fallen behind, and now even the basics, like electricity, were being taken away from them. Isabella felt a wave of despair wash over her. The house, which already seemed like a fragile refuge, now felt cold and empty. She quietly walked to her mother's room, where she found her lying down, weak but awake. "They cut the power, Mom," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice calm, but the tremor in her words gave her away. Her mother, with her soft voice, only whispered, "Everything will be okay, my dear. Don't worry." But how could Isabella not worry? Reality was crumbling around her. Her mother's health was worsening, the house would be taken in a few days, and now even the lights had been cut off. Feeling utterly powerless, she broke down. Her strength seemed depleted, and the weight of all the hardships crashed down on her shoulders. For the first time, Isabella couldn't hide her tears from her mother. With no other option, Isabella sat on the cold, dark living room floor and let the tears flow freely. She was at her breaking point. She didn't know what to do anymore. Her efforts at the restaurant, her fight to keep everything under control, felt useless in the face of so many problems. Everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. In that moment, in the complete darkness and solitude, Isabella remembered the one thing she still had left, her faith. Her mother had always taught her that in the darkest moments, when everything seemed lost, the only way out was to completely surrender to Jesus. With a heart full of pain and despair, Isabella closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long time, prayed deeply. "Jesus, I don't know what to do. I can't keep going on my own. I need help," she whispered, feeling a sense of relief as the words escaped her lips. It was a simple prayer, but it carried the full weight of what she had been carrying. "Guide me, please. Help me see a way out. I trust in you, even when everything seems lost." The tears continued to fall as she prayed, but now there was a sense of peace beginning to emerge in the midst of the despair. It was as if, even in the darkness, a small light had been lit in her heart. Isabella didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. Her faith, which had seemed so distant, now embraced her like a warm hug. Chapter 9. The Unexpected Encounter. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to grow heavier as Isabella served the elegant customer. He watched her in a way that left her intrigued, as if he was trying to see something beyond what was visible. When he asked how she was doing, Isabella hesitated for a moment but eventually confessed her troubles. "My mother is very sick. We're struggling to pay for her treatment, and now even our house is at risk of being taken by the bank." The man remained silent for a few seconds, seeming to absorb every word. Something in his gaze changed, as if he recognized something familiar but couldn't quite place it. "And what's your mother's name?" he asked in a low voice, almost as if he feared the answer. "Her name is Sophia Martins," Isabella replied, not realizing the impact that simple piece of information would have. Upon hearing the name, the man's expression changed completely. He turned pale and his breathing quickened. "Sophia Martins," he repeated almost in a whisper, as if the name carried a heavy weight of memories. I knew a Sophia Martins. She was my girlfriend in high school. We were deeply in love, but I had to move away for college. I never saw her again." There was pain in his voice, a deep regret for something that seemed unresolved from the past. Now curious, Isabella asked, "My mother also told me she had a boyfriend in high school, but he moved away and they never saw each other again. Do you think it could be—" The man didn't need any more details. He already knew, deep in his heart, the truth. "I loved her so much, Isabella. Sophia was everything to me. When I got accepted to college in another city, I had to leave, but I never forgot her. I always wondered what had happened to her, why we lost contact. And now, hearing her name, learning about your mother, this can't be a coincidence." He looked deeply into Isabella's eyes, and at that moment, everything made sense. You're my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sophia never told me she was pregnant. I had no idea I had a daughter." Isabella felt her heart race. The revelation was overwhelming. How could she process all of this? The owner of the restaurant where she had endured so much humiliation was, in fact, her biological father. "You're my daughter," he repeated now with tears in his eyes. "And your mother, Sophia, she's sick. I had no idea any of this was happening." Isabella could hardly believe what she was hearing. This man she had just met was her father, the same man her mother had loved in her youth. "I never knew about you. I never knew any of this," she said, still trying to grasp everything. "My mother always spoke of a love she had in school, but she never went into details." The man gently took Isabella's hand. "I never wanted to leave you both alone. If I had known, if only I had known, none of this would have happened. I would have stayed with you." His words were filled with pain and regret. "Now more than ever, I need to help you both. You're my family. You're my—" Chapter 10. Revelations and Decisions. Isabella was still in shock from the revelation, her mind trying to process what she had just heard. The man sitting across from her, the owner of the restaurant where she had endured so many humiliations, was her biological father. A feeling of confusion and disbelief seemed to overwhelm her thoughts, but something deeper, a silent connection, was starting to form between them. Her father, still shaken by the discovery, seemed determined not to waste any more time. Isabella, I never would have left you and your mother if I had known you existed. I loved your mother more than anything. When I moved away for college, it was the hardest decision of my life. Sophia was everything to me, and I always imagined that one day our paths would cross again. But I never thought it would happen like this. He paused, visibly emotional, as he held Isabella's hand firmly. Now that I know everything, I can't allow you to keep going through this. I want to help you and your mother. I know it's a lot to take in all at once, but I'm here for both of you. We're not going to waste any more time. Isabella, despite the whirlwind of emotions, felt a spark of hope. After years of struggle and so much suffering, fate was finally offering a way out. I don't know what to say. This is so unexpected, she responded, her voice trembling. My mother is very sick. I was about to lose everything, even our home. The man looked at her with both firmness and tenderness. That's not going to happen. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure your mother gets the treatment she needs. And as for the house, don't worry. I lost you both once, and I'm not going to let you lose everything again. Her father's promise brought Isabella a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she wasn't alone. There was someone willing to fight for her mother. The figure of a father, which had always been absent from her life, was now present in a way she never imagined. In the days that followed, changes came quickly. Her father took control of the situation, resolving the financial issues with the house and ensuring that Sophia received the best treatment possible. Isabella couldn't believe how fast her life was turning around. She, who had endured humiliation, pain, and so many difficulties, was now seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. However, even with all the help, Isabella still had to face her own feelings. The pain of growing up without a father, the resentment of not knowing him earlier, and the confusion of discovering this truth so unexpectedly still weighed on her heart. But at the same time, the hope and love her father was showing for her and her mother were impossible to ignore. With each passing day, the bond between father and daughter grew stronger, and Isabella felt that she was slowly finding a new purpose in life. The job at the restaurant, which once felt like an unbearable burden, now had a new perspective. With her father by her side, she knew she could make a difference there, transforming it into a more just and welcoming environment. Chapter 11. Rebuilding Bridges. Isabella's life was changing in ways she never imagined. With the support of her newly discovered father, the problems that once seemed insurmountable were being resolved. Her mother, Sophia, began receiving the necessary treatment, and the relief Isabella felt from not having to fight alone anymore was immense. The medical bills, the eviction notice, and the constant fear of losing everything were being handled swiftly. Her father made sure to be present at every moment, reconnecting with Sophia and establishing a bond that time and distance had never erased. However, Isabella was still dealing with the emotional scars from everything she had been through. For so many years, she had gotten used to being the only one responsible for everything, and now, learning to share that responsibility was a new challenge. Sitting beside her mother in the hospital, she watched the quiet reunion between her parents. There was something magical in that moment, as if time had paused and given all of them a second chance. Her father held Sophia's hand tenderly, and the look they exchanged said everything words couldn't express. "I always knew you'd come back," Sophia said with a weak but loving smile. "I just didn't know it would be like this." Her father smiled, emotional, as he replied, "I should have come back sooner. But now, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here for you and for our daughter." Isabella felt a mix of emotions watching that scene. Part of her was still struggling to accept that all of this was real. For so long she believed she was alone, that it was just her and her mother against the world. Now there was a new reality in front of her, and she wasn't exactly sure how to feel. But as she looked at the love her parents shared, she allowed herself to believe that maybe there was redemption for all of them. With things finally starting to stabilize, Isabella returned to the restaurant, but this time with a new attitude. Carl and Mariana, who had humiliated her for so long, continued to act as if nothing had changed. They didn't know the truth about her identity had been revealed, and Isabella decided to wait for the right moment to deal with them. She wanted to transform that place, not with revenge, but with justice. As she worked, her father watched her from a distance. He saw in her the same strength that Sophia always had, a strength that impressed him. "You've inherited the best of your mother," he said once, as he approached Isabella at the end of a shift. "I'm proud of who you've become, even without me being there." Isabella smiled, still getting used to this new reality. "I'm still learning to deal with all of this," she admitted, "but I'm ready to make a difference here. I want this restaurant to be a fair place where no one has to go through what I did." Her father nodded, proud. "And it will be. You have the power to change things. We'll do it together." Isabella knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. Now, with her family reunited and with a new vision for the future, she was ready to transform her life and the restaurant into something far greater than she ever imagined. Chapter 12: Justice and Renewal. Now that the truth about her origins had been revealed, Isabella was ready to confront those who had humiliated and treated her with disdain during her time at the restaurant. With her father by her side and the strength of justice guiding her decisions, she knew it was time to make the necessary changes. Power was no longer in the hands of Carl and Mariana, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. That morning, Isabella walked into the restaurant with her head held high. As usual, Carl was in the dining room, barking orders and humiliating the staff with his arrogant tone. He didn't notice Isabella at first, but soon his demeanor shifted when he saw her standing next to her father, the owner of the restaurant. The air of superiority he always carried began to crumble. "Good morning, Carl," Isabella said, with a calmness that concealed the strength she now carried. "We need to talk." Carl tried to maintain his composure, but the nervousness was visible on his face. "Talk about what?" "I've got a lot of work to do," he said, attempting to change the subject. But Isabella wasn't intimidated. "Throughout the time I worked here, I was treated with disrespect, humiliated by you and others. That changes today." Carl tried to respond, but her father stepped in with firmness. "Carl, you made a big mistake, not just with my daughter, but with many other employees who were mistreated under your supervision. Your conduct has been unacceptable, and today you will be held accountable for it." His father's tone left no room for argument. Isabella, now in control of the situation, looked Carl directly in the eyes. "I know how hard you tried to bring me down, but justice isn't about revenge. I want this restaurant to be a place of respect where everyone is treated with dignity, and you're not part of that vision." Isabella's words echoed through the dining room, and the other employees, who had always feared Carl, watched in admiration. "You're fired." Carl, pale and at a loss for words, tried to argue, but it was too late. His fate was sealed. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, trying to maintain his composure. But the authority of Isabella and her father left no doubt. He was escorted out of the restaurant, and all eyes turned to Isabella, who now felt more powerful and confident than ever. She then turned to Mariana, who had watched the scene unfold with growing anxiety. The woman who had always made snide remarks and looked down on Isabella now found herself in a position of fragility. "Mariana, you had countless chances to be a better colleague, but you chose the path of cruelty," Isabella said. "However, I believe everyone can change. I'm willing to give you another chance, but under one condition: that you treat everyone here with the respect you never showed." Mariana, surprised that she hadn't been fired, simply nodded in agreement. I understand," she said, with a humility she had never shown before. From that day on, Isabella began to reform the restaurant. She promoted those who deserved it, employees who had always worked hard but had never been given the opportunity to shine. The atmosphere changed, and the restaurant became a place where justice, respect, and collaboration prevailed. Isabella's strength, tempered by the hardships she had faced, made her a leader admired by everyone,